today is bringing some shakeups in the upcoming race for the U.S. Senate seat here in Texas. Former Congressman Colin Allred now says he will pivot from running in that primary to instead go for a seat again in the U.S. House. Meanwhile, an official announcement is set to come in less than half an hour from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett after she officially filed to run in the Senate primary. Now, while we await her remarks, we are joined this afternoon by Joshua Blank. He is the research director for the Texas Politics Project, which has conducted some polling about the Senate race in Texas. Josh, welcome back to the show, and thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Will.
So with Colin Allred no longer running statewide, that potentially sets up a Democratic Senate primary between two main candidates, Jasmine Crockett and State Representative James Tallarico here in Austin. So what does your polling show about their two standings with Texas voters?
Well, overall, Representative Crockett is the most well-known of the two candidates right now, and part of that has to do with her meteoric rise in Texas politics, but ultimately the way that she has really provided herself with a national profile that has in a lot of ways led her to make this decision to run for the U.S. Senate. And so while about the 30% of voters have a positive view of Representative Crockett, about 30% have a negative view. When you look among Texas Democrats, nearly 2/3, 62%, say they have a favorable view as of October of Representative Crockett. When it comes to State Representative James Tallarico, it's about 43% of Democrats, which I should say is no small share given that he is a state representative.
Sure. So what will these two candidates have to work on most with voters, according to what you found in your polls?
Well, interestingly enough, both are actually relatively well known to the Democratic electorate, and what they're going to want to be doing is expanding on some of the strengths that they have. Representative Crockett has developed a really strong national profile and has really I would say, painted herself to some degree as a fighter. Representative Tallarico has taken a very, I would say, different tact and really has positioned himself somewhat as I would say, a moderate in some sense, but really has used his social media profile to build a unique brand for himself. And it's going to be interesting to see two candidates who actually enter the race relatively well known to Democrats fighting it out.
Yeah, each of them have millions of followers on social media, so we'll see how that factors into things. But
and millions of dollars.
That is true as well. So the Republican Senate primary, we can't forget about that as well, is crowded with three major candidates filing to run in this. That's incumbent John Cornyn, Attorney General Ken Paxton, and Congressman Wesley Hunt. Where do these three men stand now with Republican voters in the state?
Well, look, the reality of this race and what's really motivated a lot of what's going on both sides is this expectation that Senator Cornyn, the incumbent, is going to face a difficult primary challenge, in particular from Attorney General Ken Paxton. The polling numbers generally bear this out in the sense that amongst the most active Republican voters and amongst some of those conservative voters in the state, Ken Paxton is seen more favorably than is Senator Cornyn, who has a longer record and more compromises under his belt that have ultimately led to some suspicion amongst corners within the Republican Party. For Representative Hunt, it's going to be difficult to overcome a lack of name recognition that both Cornyn and Paxton have among the Republican electorate. But all in all, this should be a very competitive race between these three men. And in reality, whoever comes out of this is going to be somewhat bruised at the end.
Okay, so I want to ask a little bit more about some of the issues that could shape up and emerge as the biggest themes for this campaign. So the economy and affordability have been two big issues that have dominated a lot of the conversations out there politically. So how does that look for Texas voters from what you found?
Look, Texas is still a big part of the United States. In fact, some would say the biggest part.
Right.
But the reality is that Texans are in a similar position to a lot of Americans. They've expressed consistent concern about prices, about the economy, about affordability, the cost of living, the cost of housing, healthcare. And that has not deviated in much of the polling. What has deviated in a lot of ways is the focus that Texas Republicans tend to have on immigration and the border. And in some ways, what's most interesting about this election cycle is acknowledging and recognizing is that with immigration and the border somewhat taken off the table because of the president's, capturing of that issue, it means that there is going to have to be a pretty open discussion about issues of affordability and both, within the parties and then between the parties, who is going to address it and how.
Okay, that is just the beginning of our conversation. Josh, I know we'll have you back at some point very soon to talk more about the numbers in your latest poll, but that is Josh Blank with the Texas Politics Project. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.